All right, guys, so we're going to take a little bit of a look at the intrinsic conduction system, or essentially the AV or nodal conduction system of the heart today. And this is kind of the electrical system and how it regulates when and where the different chambers of the heart essentially contract. Um, there are two videos that are kind of embedded into the lecture today. I'll make sure I post those separately for everybody. But they kind of go through the basics of how the system fires, when it fires, what causes what's next after it fires, and they also do a really good job of showing the EKG strip up against kind of when those kind of depolarization or repolarization of those different areas of the heart kind of take place. So again, I'll post these two videos so you guys take a look at them and kind of measure them up against the different types of waves. Okay. So just kind of in general here, the heart conduction system is usually referred to as the intrinsic conduction system because it's internal. This is also referred to simply as the nodal system because it's controlled by essentially two different nodes, the SA node or sinoatrial node, as well as the AV node or atrioventricular node. The heart cells are forced to contract because of the nerve impulses that pass along this system. So without that system, the heart muscle itself will not contract. And in cases of, say, like cardiac arrest or loss of blood, things like that, they can actually cause differences in the conduction system. They can cause it to stop. So say like you had a cardiac arrest or a cardio myopathy or some sort of damage to the heart muscle itself, that could damage that fiber, and then that part of the fiber doesn't fire. One of the major ones that we really would have an issue with is if we have damage to this first node, the SA node, because most often this is referred to as the pacemaker of the heart. Without it firing, the rest of that system can't fire efficiently on its own. It can fire, but doesn't fire well. So we really need that SA node to fire when it's supposed to kind of control this whole system, which is most often why if a patient has an issue with their SA node, they can have either an external pacemaker implanted or they can have an internal pacemaker implanted. And all that is a device that usually has a lead, an electrical lead that goes down into the heart, and then the leads are usually attached to the outer surface of the heart, or in some cases, they're embedded in the heart wall itself, right about the level of where that SA node should be or should fire. And then if the pacemaker picks up a decrease in that electrical activity or not enough response in a timely fashion, then obviously the pacemaker itself will fire. External auditory or external defibrillators or devices that we can use to kind of jumpstart people's heart from the outside are another way to do that. And essentially what we're just trying to do is pass a massive amount of electricity over the top of the heart to get it to contract. And a lot of times, because of the way the cells of the heart are designed, they will contract on their own if they're given that information or given that kind of direction from something external. Heart muscles, if they're contracting and you put them together, they will start to beat continuously together. So that's one of the ways that we can kind of look at that. But you've got five basic parts that make up this system. You've got your SA node, which is your pacemaker. You got your atrioventricular node, which is the secondary node. So SA node sits at the top of the atrium. The AV node or atrioventricular node sits right at the top of the opening to the right ventricle. All right, so it sits about at the level there. The next thing would be the atrioventricular bundle. That's this kind of branching system that runs down the intraventricular septum of the heart. The bundle branches are those that kind of reach out away from the heart, or from that branch itself into the different walls of the ventricles. And then the last ones are the Purkinje fibers. And those are the ones that actually reach up the sides of the heart. So I apologize, my little diagram here is in the way, but they reach up around the myocardium that then surrounds the ventricles on both sides, essentially finishing off this contraction and getting those ventricles to contract on their own. All right. The conduction system, again, is initiated specifically by that SA node. That's why that's so important. And then it's sequential from there on out. So it just kind of continues to cascade along. If you think of like a set of Christmas lights that blink from one end to the other, all right, the first one blinking causes the next one to blink and so on because the current is passed along that system. And that's kind of how this happens here. Okay. This just shows you again kind of a little bit in a larger picture. So you've got number one here, this little portion up here is your SA node. So when it fires, it sends electrical current out throughout the entire um, atrium. So when it fires directly after that, the atrials will contract. Once they contract, that electrical impulse then is passed along to the AV node. And when the AV node fires, this electrical impulse follows down the AV bundle into the branch bundles, and then into essentially what are referred to as the Purkinje fiber. So it just kind of works like a cascading effect to make its way down the rest of the heart. And then once it makes this little turn around the corner and goes up, then the ventricles will fully contract, forcing that blood into the corresponding arteries, either the pulmonary artery, if we're talking about the right ventricle here, or the aorta, the systemic arteries in the left ventricle. Right. One of the ways that we can actually visually see how that system is working is using an EKG or an ECG. They essentially are the same thing. They're just looking at the different conduction systems of the heart. And they usually are broken up into a couple different segments. You get what's referred to as a P wave. That's the initiating wave. So that's usually what we see when the SA node fires. So if a person has an EKG that is missing that P wave, we worry that they then have some sort of an issue with their SA node. Um, this next portion here is kind of a lag time between when the atrioventricular node fires. So this is essentially when the atrias are actually contracting during this phase. So the distance between the P wave and the what's called the QRS complex is kind of a judge as to kind of the basics of kind of the health of the heart here. The Q is actually when the AV node fires. The R is when it kind of makes its way around and heads up the Purkinje fiber. So this peak is usually representative of when the ventricles are actually contracting. Again, we can measure the distance of that peak. We can measure the height of that peak and give us an idea of the actual strength of the contraction of the heart itself. Interestingly enough, if somebody has a heart attack and they have some damage specifically to their ventricles, we can actually see that on their EKG, but usually by sorry, I click forward, usually by a decreased height of that R wave, and that can cause some issues. The S is essentially when the ventricles are starting to relax and kind of depolarize. And then we get this what's referred to as ST segment. So this segment moving its way over here when the rest of that kind of is starting to relax and we get blood filling back into the heart over here on this side. Okay. This shows you a little bit better of kind of how that pacemaker kind of works. So here you can see the SA node is fired. So we start to see that little upward tick in the EKG, right? Once that has made its way throughout the entire atrial system, we start to see that decrease in that wave because now the atrials have contracted and started to relax. Okay. This little dip downwards, like I was saying, is once the AV node fires and that signal starts to make its way down towards the apex of the heart. All right. And then once it makes it to those Purkinje fibers, that's that R wave, that huge wave that goes upwards. And then when it peaks back down, we get a little bit of relaxation in that. And then this little blip is just kind of the heart resetting itself or kind of depolarizing, getting ready to contract again. Again, anywhere along this system, you can see it pretty quickly if a person has an issue with their heart. I'm not very good at it because I don't read them on a daily basis. My wife, she used to work quite a bit in the emergency room, and she could take a look at somebody's EKG strip pretty quickly and tell you what's wrong with their heart. One of my aunts was actually a cardiac nurse for a long period of time, and she was really good at it. You could show her something, but it's one of those things that can kind of be used to kind of give us an idea of what's going on. Another thing that's kind of interesting to see is that if somebody has been electrocuted or had some sort of an electrical shock, it actually shows up on their EKG for a long period of time because it disrupts the rhythm of the heart. I used to do some injury prevention stuff for ComEd, Commonwealth Edison, and guys that would be electrocuted or come into contact with electricity on the job. You could see it on their EKG. It would show up for long periods of time in there. Okay, so you can kind of see those different types of ideas there. This just shows you a little bit of kind of the basic cardiac cycle. So there are three basic portions to this. There's what's referred to as mid to late diastole. All right, so this is filling of the heart and blood flowing down into the ventricles. All right, ventricular systole. All All right, so this is the difference between the systolic and diastolic pressure that you see on when you get like the blood pressure taken on your arm. All right, so diastolic pressure is when the heart is relaxed. Systolic pressure is when the heart is contracting. All right, and usually we're only getting ventricular systole pressure because that is the most forceful. Plus, it's the only pressure that's being forced out into one of our arteries. Okay, and then you get this last stage, which is early diastole. Again, when everything has started to relax, the ventricles have relaxed, blood is then refilling back into the atriums. The atrioventricular valves are closed at that point, so blood is filling. Whereas in mid to late diastole, those valves are open and then the SLV valves are closed. Okay, so you can see a little bit of that basic portion there. Again, heart cardiac cycle, atrial contraction is simultaneously, so both atria contract at the same time, both ventricles contract at the same time. So when the atrias contract, the ventricles are relaxed, sort of filling up like a balloon because blood is flowing downward. And then when the ventricles contract, the atrials are relaxed so that those valves, those AV valves, will close, and then blood can be forced out through the SLV valves. Again, this is what we were talking about just a few minutes ago with blood pressure. So your systolic pressure is contraction, specifically ventricular contraction. That should be higher. Your diastolic pressure should be lower. When those two numbers get really close together, we worry that the heart is being worked too hard because the pressure in the arterial system, arteries specifically, is high when those numbers are kind of close together with each other. So when you hear like 110 over 80 or 100 over 80, that's kind of what's sort of normal. It used to be 120 over like 80 or 120 over 90, and now they've lowered that even more. But the 120, again, is your systolic pressure. The 80 is the diastolic pressure, so the bottom number. You want those to be a little bit further apart than they should be. So if you get up into the 200s, then you worry that you're getting a really strong heart contraction because either the heart's being overworked or there's a blockage somewhere along the arterial system, right? And we got to kind of keep an eye on those. This is just a little bit more about that cardiac cycle itself. So this is one complete heartbeat. Again, so mid to late diastole, blood is flowing into the ventricles. So essentially the AV valves are open and blood is just flowing downwards. Ventricular systole, so this is when the blood pressure is building and the AV valves would be closed, okay? And then you get what's referred to as early diastole. The atrials start to refill with blood, but the ventricles are still closed off because those atrioventricular valves are still closed there. Okay. There's a couple things we talk about with heart when we talk about specifically health. So we look at two things. We look at cardiac output or stroke volume. Cardiac output is essentially the amount of blood that can be pumped out of each side of the heart in 1 minute. All right. So we can get cardiac output by essentially taking our heart rate and multiplying it by our stroke volume, which we'll talk about here in just a second. And that gives us our general cardiac output. All right. Stroke volume is essentially the volume of blood that is actually being pumped out of the heart in each contraction. So how much blood is being ejected during that contraction, and that will give us our basic cardiac output. That can be measured a couple different ways. We can measure it with blood pressure cuff itself, so we can look at that diastolic versus systolic pressure number, and then we can also do like electrocardiograms and things like that that can give us a little bit of an idea of what's actually being pumped out of the heart at one time. All right. So the heart regulation of the heart. So stroke volume usually remains relatively constant. We don't usually see a huge change in that unless you've got some sort of damage to the heart or there's a disease that's causing an enlargement of the heart. All right. So again, remember, stroke volume is the amount of blood. So the volume that's being pumped out. So that usually doesn't change, and unless, so obviously a kid's stroke volume is much less than an adult stroke volume, so because their heart is much bigger. But if you've got somebody, say, with a condition called like Marfan's is a genetic disorder where they usually have an enlargement of the heart. If that's the case, then their stroke volume would be a lot larger than a normal person's, and we could see that. Athletes most often have a larger stroke volume because, again, they've conditioned their heart to be able to eject more blood to continue to feed the muscles that they need to be able to continue to move. All right. This whole thing of Starling's law. So the more cardiac muscle is stretched, the stronger the contraction. All right. That's the basics of kind of what we were just kind of collecting there. So the more blood coming in, you're going to have a stronger contraction because of that. The only real way to change this process, obviously, then is to change the heart rate. If we go back and look at that equation, heart rate is the one thing we can change. Stroke volume really isn't going to change. All right, we can only change heart rate here. So that changing that heart rate is really the only way to change our cardiac output. Obviously, if we're under stress, it should change. If we're trying to walk up and down stairs, our stroke volume should go, or not stroke volume, sorry, cardiac output should go up because our heart rate should increase. If it doesn't, then we worry that we've got some sort of an issue here. Um, Cardiac regulation, I don't want to confuse you guys too much with this whole diagram here, but there are two basic systems that control it here. You can see one over here, which is the parasympathetic. This decreases heart rate for us, and then our sympathetic system increases our heart rate for us. Those are our two basic systems that try to bring that back into play. This does a little bit better job, I think, showing it than the diagram on that last slide. So these are our factors that increase heart rate. Obviously, you can see some of these are pretty simple. Exercise, fight or flight. So if you're in a situation where you feel like you're being stressed, hormones, specifically your epinephrine and thyroxine, or epinephrine and norepinephrine. And also, if we have an increased venous return, if there's more blood filling into the heart for some reason at one point in time, then we're going to have a harder contraction. Other things that would increase it, if we have a low blood pressure, so the hypothalamus of our brain detects that there's a decrease in blood pressure. If we also detect that there's a decrease in blood volume, so if we have a cut, we're bleeding out, our heart rate will increase to try to levelize or equalize, this low blood volume. And then body heat. If our temperature goes up, our heart rate will go up. So because we're trying to pump more blood specifically to the surface of our skin to try to cool ourselves down. Factors that decrease it, then obviously we see the opposite here. We've got the parasympathetic system. That's our rest and digest system. If we have high blood pressure, our heart rate should decrease, right? If we have high blood volume, so for some reason our blood is thicker than what it should be, we would see a decrease. If there's less venous return, so not enough blood getting back to the heart, we could see a decrease. And then again, if our body temperature decreases, our heart rate will decrease as well, because we want to try to warm that blood back up. There are two conditions that we usually look at. One's called bradycardia, the other one's called tachycardia. Bradycardia is usually a heart rate that is lower than 60 beats per minute, so this is a really slow heart rate. Tachycardia is usually a high heart rate, something above 100 beats per minute. Your normal resting heart rate should be somewhere between 60 to 80 beats per minute. And that's pretty average for a lot of people. Athletes should be on the lower end. It's not unheard of seeing athletes with heartbeats in the 30s and 40s. And people with disorders or disease, a lot of times will have heart rates above that. The way to kind of remember that is a little hint here. So there are two ways to kind of think about it. Think of things being done essentially tacky. Tacky means sloppily, so that would be done fast. So you would see a tachycardia kind of rhythm. All right, you can see the two rhythm strips here at the bottom. So you got bradycardia on the side. So you've got huge distances between your EKG strips or EKG waves. And then over on the right-hand side, you see tachycardia. Those waves and those peaks are kind of stacked up against each other because the heart is beating much faster in those cases. Okay. And then this is our corny joke that usually shows up around Valentine's Day. We're a little late, but you make my heart go tachycardy. So it kind of makes it speed up that process. Okay. All right. We're going to go ahead and stop there. Hopefully that kind of helps finish up a little bit of some of the stuff for the heart.